Hi, this is Philip Anthony Albertelli, and welcome to The Week in Doubt, episode 31. Before we start, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Tony Borer for liking the Week in Doubt Facebook page. Slowly but surely, the Facebook page is continuing to garner attention. I wouldn't say we have an army's worth of people, maybe more like half of a very small ragtag militia. Please don't take my military metaphors too seriously. Okay, usually I devote most of each episode to a particular topic or theme and then do a couple of small news stories before digging in. But this week it's going to be all about the news stories because there's a lot of them out there. And a couple of episodes back, episode 29 it was, I had talked about the uproar over a YouTube movie entitled The Innocence of Muslims. And unless you absolutely shield yourself from any news sources, you've probably heard about this. How a Coptic Christian living in the States had made an inflammatory anti-Islamic movie, in that supposedly in part this movie has triggered embassy attacks and protests throughout the Muslim world. In fairness, supposedly there were pro-Al-Qaeda attacks that were already being planned before this, before the uproar about the movie even broke. So at least in part, I'm sure there is a lot of genuine outrage over the movie in the Muslim world, but at least in part, the embassy attacks, at least the one in Benghazi, Libya, the pro-Al-Qaeda groups could have been just using it as an excuse to finally initiate the attack. I had mentioned during episode 29 that this whole uproar supposedly caused by this movie reminded me of the uproar over the Danish cartoons back in, I think it was 2005. And strangely enough, shortly after I did episode 29, news of new Muslim cartoons broke. Now, I'm not sure on all the details about these new cartoons, but they seem to be throwing fuel on the fire as far as those already existing protests throughout the Muslim world are concerned. So today in Aram Online, is this an Egyptian newspaper? There's a story, and as I'm recording this, it's Sunday the 23rd, 2012, obviously. 500 protest anti-Islam film cartoon in Istanbul. Hundreds of Turkish protesters chant Allahu Akbar during a protest in Istanbul against anti-Islam American film and French cartoons. Hundreds of protesters in Istanbul burnt U.S. and Israeli flags Sunday in heated reaction against an American film and French cartoons that have sparked, they say, deadly riots. I think that's a typo. They probably mean sparked deadly riots across the Middle East and North Africa. Around 500 people gathered around the Turkish city's iconic Taksim Square, chanting Allahu Akbar as they burnt Western flags in a display of fury for the inflammatory depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. The crowd unfurled banners reading "Death to America" and "Death to France" as they shouted anti-Western slogans, urging the Muslim world to react against the anti-Islamic depictions in the West. Now, I'm glad I'm touching on this subject matter again because it gives me a chance to clear some things up. I've quickly become online friends with Chris Weber from C-Web's Sunday School, which is an excellent podcast for non-believers. And we've been having conversations back and forth, emailing each other and kind of critiquing each other's episodes. And I got the feeling that in response to episode 29, maybe he thought I was being too soft on Islam, or kind of maybe being too politically correct or handling the feelings of Muslim adherents with kid gloves. Hopefully it didn't necessarily come across that way. I think one problem with episode 29, which hindered me being understood clearly, was simply the technical glitches. I probably haven't experienced any technical glitches like that since maybe my first two episodes. There was a lot of white noise in the second half of the episode, and it made it hard to understand what I was saying. And I did say that I did think that the movie Innocence of Muslims was in poor taste, that it was inflammatory. But I also said, I was about to say clearly said, but maybe not so considering all the audio distortion in the second half of the episode. I did say that I thought they did have every right to make the movie. And I also expressed my sympathetic view of the Danish cartoonists and how I thought they had every right to draw those cartoons, even if those cartoons were considered inflammatory or defamatory. Now, I thought on the one hand, although the cartoons might have been insulting and offensive to Islam, because of course we know in Islam it's forbidden to depict the Prophet Muhammad unless he's, as you sometimes see, depicted with a veil blocking his face. So depictions of the Prophet Muhammad unveiled with these kind of fiendish looking facial features and a bomb in his turban, we can see why that would be offensive to Muslims. But I also said how I thought that the cartoons served a purpose and that they addressed the problem in the modern world with fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. And of course, the point I made in episode 29 that I think was rather poignant, not to toot my own horn, was the hypocrisy, and I'm probably not the first to point this out, the hypocrisy and the irony that people in the Muslim world were offended by these cartoons which depicted them as these kind of bloodthirsty barbarians. And so how did they respond? With violence. You don't like that someone is depicting you as violent, so you retaliate with yet more violence. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's very hypocritical. And at the same time, I did, admittedly, and I still stand by this, I did defend certain aspects of Islam, and that I acknowledge the contributions of Islam throughout the centuries, contribution of Islamic scholars to the sciences, and how if it wasn't for the preservation of ancient Greek texts by Islamic scholars, a lot of the classics might be lost to us. And just like Christianity, although I don't believe in the supernatural claims of either religion, both have contributed significantly to art and music, architecture. Even though I don't necessarily agree with their conclusions, there's also a lot of great Islamic and Christian philosophers as well. And personally, I'm a fan of world music, and some of my favorite world music is Arabic or Muslim music. One of my favorite poets is Rumi, but that's not too original. You'll hear a lot of Westerners espouse their love of Rumi. And Rumi is if you're not familiar with him, he's almost a household name. He was a Sufi dervish poet who wrote this really brilliant, ecstatic poetry that I think intentionally is left open to interpretation a lot of times as to whether he's addressing God or a lover in his ecstatic poems, but it's very transcendent stuff. And out of all the different forms of Islam, I think Sufi Islam is considered one of the more tolerant or pacifistic or transcendental of the different types. But back to my criticisms. As I've spoken about many times on the show, one of my favorite podcasts or online news shows is The Young Turks, hosted by Cenk Uygur, who at a very early age moved with his family from Turkey to the States. And Cenk's fully Americanized, and he was raised Muslim, but he now considers himself an agnostic, and he might be one of the strongest critics you'll hear about fundamentalist Islam. And Cenk, a few times recently on the heels of these stories, made a great point that, yeah, we may not want to go out of our way to insult or demean someone else's beliefs. But that being said, just because your religion forbids you from doing something doesn't mean it forbids us. As a Muslim, you're not supposed to depict the Prophet Muhammad. But as Cenk says, if you're not a Muslim, you're not forbidden from depicting the Prophet Muhammad. And what sense does it make to resort to violence because someone drew a picture you didn't agree with, no matter how much it goes against the tenets of your personal faith? It's not forbidden for people outside your faith. And you should try to have some tolerance and maybe try to see things with a bit of cultural relativism. I think it was recently I was watching Cenk touch on this topic on his Young Turks TV show that you can now see weeknights at 7 Eastern Time on Current. Look at me doing all these plugs. And he was talking to a representative from CARE. I forgot the acronym for a moment, but it's Council on American Islamic Relations. That's what it is. And Cenk was having a friendly conversation with this guy, and he asked him straight out, you know, if you're not Muslim, why are we forbidden from doing the things that your faith forbids you from doing, such as drawing cartoons, imbibing alcohol, or whatever it is, you know? And the guy tried to give his reasons why he didn't think it was respectful to do the cartoons, etc. But he acquiesced. He conceded that obviously you should resort to violence because you disagree with someone drawing a cartoon or something like that, or even making a defamatory movie. And it was funny because he mentioned in passing how because Muslims also believe in Jesus, not quite in the same way that Christians traditionally do, but because they believe in or honor Jesus too, that he had been personally offended by the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. And it's funny because when that movie came out, there was a huge uproar among Christians who thought that that movie was absolutely blasphemous. And I'm not saying this out of spite just to stick it to believers because I'm a non-believer, but The Last Temptation of Christ is one of my favorite all-time movies. I absolutely thought it was beautiful. The only thing I didn't like about the movie, and it's not a moral criticism at all, was the fact that Harvey Keitel and some of the other casts once in a while, you know, they kind of slip into a New York accent and it would take you out of the reality of the story, so to speak. It would kind of interrupt the suspension of disbelief. Like, why does this first century Jew have a modern New York accent? But anyway, I thought it was a beautiful movie, and I thought for me it was a movie that was an allegory about personal salvation, about finding oneself, about wrestling with your inner demons, about a kind of spiritual inner struggle. And I just absolutely loved it. I thought it was a very deep, profound movie. And if you're a biblical literalist, or if you're a Christian fundamentalist, I could see how you might find it offensive. Even if you're a cafeteria Catholic, I can see how you might find the movie offensive because it depicts Jesus as kind of having a romantic or semi-romantic relationship with Mary Magdalene, or having sexual fantasies and stuff like this. But I think what was really powerful to me about that movie was that this wasn't a Jesus who knew he was the Son of God and accepted it gracefully. This was a Jesus who was at the start uncomfortable in his own skin, who wasn't sure if he really was the Son of God or if he was going mad. and was undergoing this great agonizing inner struggle. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's based on a book. So Jesus lives this whole alternate life. He avoids being crucified. He grows up and has a wife and kids, and he grows old. And then you realize near the end of the movie that that was the last temptation. And as an old man, Jerusalem's burning. Jesus goes up onto a hill and cries out to God how he wants to be crucified. He wants to be the Messiah. And then he appears on the cross, dying for the sins of the world. And it turns out that that whole alternative life was just kind of a vision or daydream. It was the last temptation, which he ended up overcoming and does inevitably die on the cross. So I'm not a believer, but I was raised Catholic, and in a way I found it a very moving story. I think it's probably one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. But I know the Last Temptation of Christ is a relatively old movie, so this isn't about any. This doesn't have a lot to do with any modern news stories, so I'll get off of it. I just couldn't resist the temptation, no pun intended, to fawn over that movie. Before I move on to the next news story, I did want to say that in the email that Chris Weber sent me regarding episode 29, he did make a really good point about Muslim PR. And I think that PR is a good term for it. And Chris made the point that it doesn't seem like very often we hear about moderate or progressive Muslims coming out and denouncing the violent actions of their fundamentalist brethren. How much of that is because maybe even moderate Muslims agree on some level that you shouldn't be denigrating the Prophet, and so they don't speak out against it, even though they themselves don't resort to violence. Or I don't know how much of it, in fairness, is maybe there are a lot of moderate Muslims out there who denounce the violence, but they maybe they don't have enough media access. They don't have for lack of a lesser term, a bully pulpit to speak out from. But regards to that, there was one ray of hope. It was refreshing. In the aftermath of the attack on the embassy in Libya, in which the U.S. ambassador was slain, there were a lot of Muslims who took to the street carrying signs expressing their sympathies for the death of the ambassador and apologizing for the violent actions of the fundamentalists. So I thought that was really nice to see. And it would be good if we did see more of that type of thing. And back to the PR, it is funny, not funny, haha. But when I think back to my view of Islam prior to 9/11 and now after 9/11, I try to be as open-minded and as enlightened as possible. And as I've said on at least a couple episodes now, there's still a lot of things I admire about Islam. But I think my gut reaction has changed, and maybe yours has as well. Before 9/11, and I mean, I'm not naive. I know that terrorism in the Middle East has been a problem for a long time before 9/11. But before 9/11, when I heard Islam, I thought about these exotic, hospitable lands filled with minarets and spires and peaceful people praying. I thought about the poetry of Rumi. I thought about all that Arabic traditional music that I love. I thought about that kind of age of Islamic enlightenment and the dark and Middle Ages that I spoke about, when Muslim scholars helped to preserve the classics and offered a place of learning that attracted people from around the known world. And maybe I even thought of kind of silly but romantic things like Lawrence of Arabia and stuff like that. Um, and now, when I hear Islam, I'm kind of ashamed and sad to say it, but I guess it's not my fault. The first things that come to my mind are brutal, barbaric beheadings, planes slamming into towers, raging hordes of violent protesters chomping at the bit to get their hands into people holed up inside of embassies or whatever it is. I think about suicide bombers. I think about child suicide bombers. Um, I mean, it's sad that nowadays those are the things that flash in my mind when I hear Islam. Because, as I said, there's things that I appreciate about it. Um, so I think there is a PR problem. And in fairness to moderate Muslims, like I said, I don't know how much of us not hearing their voices is because they're not speaking out or because they don't get the airtime. Uh, but hopefully we'll continue to see things like positive, life affirming counter protests by Muslims after acts of violence and terrorism. There were a few news stories I wanted to do, but I'll probably only have time to do one more. So I'll do one I just discovered this morning. I found it on the Huffington Post, and it's about some controversial comments Joel Osteen made on TV this morning. He was on this morning's edition of Starting Point with Soledad O'Brien, along with former Bill Clinton advisor Richard Socarides. And I guess a conversation ensued that went something like this, and I'm reading from the Huffington Post article. O'Brien: but for people who are gay, you're saying so then you shouldn't be gay. Osteen: well, I think that's the big debate. The scripture says you've got to work out your own salvation. Socarides: do you think you can choose to be gay or not gay? You think you choose to be straight? Osteen: I know I have not chosen to be straight. I just feel like that's who I am. Socarides: so how can I choose to be gay? Apparently, Socarides is gay. Uh, but the title of the article the Huffington Post gave it is Joel Osteen says being straight is not a choice, but maintains being gay is a sin. I don't know if you're familiar with Joel Osteen, but he's one of the biggest televangelists, mega church personalities in the country. And in a way, he kind of reminds me of Mike Huckabee. Not physically, obviously. Mike Huckabee's this big, balding, middle-aged guy. Joel Osteen's more of like a string bean type of build. But both of them come across as these kind of like smiling human teddy bears, affecting this attitude like, oh, we love anyone, wouldn't hurt a fly, but in our eyes, your lifestyle's a sin. And sometimes you'll even hear them spout the same type of venomous stuff you hear from neocons, but they deliver it with that kind of saccharine smile or attitude. And obviously, I think it's an offensive way of saying here is that I think most normal people, I think most reasonable, sensible people would agree that, in a sense, your sexuality is etched in stone. For the most part, it's probably biological. And what I ground that on, when I look at my own life experience, being a straight guy, I can remember as early as elementary school, maybe somewhere in between third and fifth grade, all of a sudden making eye contact with the little girl sitting across from me and feeling this kind of electricity or this rush, and then it went from that to noticing the curves of like Suzanne Summers on reruns of Three's Company. Not to mention the curves on Chitara from the Thundercats. That's kind of embarrassing to mention, but then it went to noticing the curves of some of my more attractive female teachers. And before you know it, the girls around me as we got older started to develop, and my heart started pounding out of my chest. So no one ever had to tell me to be straight. No one ever had to tell me to like girls. If anything, I came from a really kind of conservative, at least morally, Catholic family where you couldn't even put like Pamela Anderson posters on the wall. I can remember buying like Samantha Fox calendars and posters. I had to hide them under my bureau. Uh, so there wasn't a lot of sex talk, anything like that. Um, if anything, if I did things that reinforced my sexuality, like I said, I was naturally attracted to women, so I tried to hang up posters and stuff, and I was kind of, punished for it or whatever, um, or deterred. And so I think about how strongly my own sexual feelings arose, and I cannot in a million years imagine just getting up and going, oh, maybe I'll try the same sex today. I don't see that happening. The biological drive seems so strong. I can't imagine it being a matter of choice. Um, so I think for the most part, uh, gay people are probably born gay just the way straight people are born straight. I think sometimes there can be cultural factors. If you look at things like supposedly, there's some cultures around the world where the sexes are kept separate at youth, um, whether it's in schools or whatever, and there's more likely to be homosexual experimentation when you keep the sexes segregated from one another. Or if you look at, say, like ancient Greece, where there might have been a kind of misogynistic attitude, and men might have, to some degree, viewed women as baby making machines, but they found their true romantic relationships with members of the same sex. And even in the ancient Greek military, there's things like the Sacred Band of Thebes, where these military groups where men were encouraged to have romantic relationships with one another, kind of the opposite of today's military, where in this thinking it was, if you cared about someone romantically or sexually, you might be more willing to fight and die for them. Um, Whereas in modern thinking, but of course, we're making progress with things like the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's been this thinking that sexuality should be completely removed from the military and it's a distraction. Whereas sometimes in the ancient world, um, romantic attachment was used to supposedly fuel one's desire to fight and die for the person next to you. Um, so I think there are some cases where there can be a social or cultural component, and I'm not sure what role, say, like sexual child abuse plays. If a child is abused by a same-sex predator, will that in some way affect their sexual development? I don't know what the answer is to that. But I think generally speaking, like say someone who hasn't suffered abuse or something like that, I think you're just attracted to who you're attracted to. I imagine that gay individuals are probably as strongly or as naturally strongly attracted to the same sex as I was as a kid and still am to the opposite sex. Um, I think that sex drive is too powerful to be simply a matter of choice. And then, of course, you look to science in the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is rife with examples of homosexuality and bisexuality. Often the one of the excuses bigoted people would use why homosexuality was wrong is because supposedly it's not natural. Well, if it occurs in many animal species, it can be found throughout the animal kingdom, and it seems to also occur naturally in some humans, then how can you argue that it's not natural? Some people might say, oh, slippery slope. If we allow you to be homosexual, what's to stop you from doing this and that? Or um, why don't we allow pedophilia and things like that? Well, obviously, the huge key difference is it's about love and sexual relationships between consenting adults. Just as it's all right for two adults of opposite gender to love each other, but it's not all right for an adult to go after a child of the opposite or same sex. It's also all right, in my point of view, for two people of the same sex, consenting adults, to love one another, but it's not all right for them to go after a child of either sex. So I don't think that the argument that it's some deviant thing that if we allow it, it's a slippery slope holds any water. It's kind of like Bill O'Reilly when he talks about the slippery slope that if we allowed gay marriage, then before you know it, you'll have people marrying dogs or tricycles or shoes or whatever it is. Once again, it's about relationships between consenting adults. And I think there's a big difference between two people of the same sex loving each other than a guy trying to marry a barnyard animal or something, or a tennis shoe. But I think what's really offensive of what Joel Osteen was saying is that he's willing to admit that his sexuality is natural and didn't have a choice, but he just insultingly assumes that the gay person chooses to be the way they are and that it's not natural. And I was thinking to myself, I'm not the first person to say this, who would choose to be gay? When you think about all of the harassment, the bigotry, I think things are changing. I think younger generations now care less about who's gay and who isn't. But imagine for most of recent history how badly gay kids must have got picked on growing up, and the tumult it caused maybe in their families when they had to come out to like a conservative family or something like that. And also, if choose to be gay, then what you do with those natural impulses for the opposite sex. That seems like that would be masochistic too. If you were naturally attracted to women, but you decide, hey, let's be gay, it seems like you'd be denying yourself. So it actually just doesn't make sense. The whole idea that you would choose. As I said, in some circumstances, there may be some cultural or social influences. But I think, and I could be wrong, but there's even been brain scans and testing done that says anatomically there are some differences between the brain of a gay individual and a straight individual. My guess is it's hormonal or anatomical in the brain or something like that. Just as I think there are people, transgender people who are born feeling like they're in the wrong body. And scientifically, we know now that on the outside, you can have the anatomy of one gender, but maybe something goes wrong hormonally while the fetus is developing or whatever, and you can end up having a person who feels as if they were geared to be female, but they're in a male body, or vice versa. I think the same is probably true with homosexuality. Just something happens during development that leads the person hormonally to be attracted to the same sex. I don't see anything wrong with it. If it's between consenting adults, you're not hurting anyone. As I said, you can find examples of it in nature. So I guess it's just another example of bigoted people on the right who maybe don't know what they're talking about or would rather not do the research, just putting their foot in their mouth so they can hold on to their bigoted views. And for someone like Joel Osteen, also, he's got all that mega church money riding on what he says. So if he was to come out and say that being gay is not a choice and something that occurs naturally in an individual, the money might stop flowing a little. But maybe that's too cynical, and maybe I'm being too harsh or presumptuous, but it's food for thought. But anyway, I think I'll leave it there for this week. Once again, this has been the Week in Doubt. As always, you can like the videos on YouTube or subscribe through YouTube. You can subscribe through iTunes, as well as rate us on iTunes. You can subscribe or listen through Podbean. And if you have any comments or want to get in touch, you can do that through the Facebook page. Or did I mention like us on Facebook? That would be much appreciated. Or I think you can also get in touch with me through Podbean. I think they have a messaging system too. All right, thank you.